Hi. Well, I certainly wish I was there with y'all in New York. Thank you so much, Tamara and Allison and the others from the US-Cuba Normalization Teaching Committee for giving me the honor of speaking, especially with these esteemed sisters and friends from Cuba. Um, like I said, I wish I was there with you. I'm Deb Goldman, and I'm on the advisory committee of the U.S. Women in Cuba collaboration and co-chair along with Moon Vasquez of the Lesbians and Allies Project. Um, First of all, I want to thank Osmaida for her amazing presentation, giving us a wonderful history of the FMC and the model for a progressive way forward in terms of women's advancement in all facets of society, like she said, economic, political, social. The U.S. Women in Cuba collaboration is very proud to have been working very closely with FMC and ICAP for over 20 years now, building strong relations, learning from them, supporting them, and strengthening our solidarity towards ending the inhumane U.S. blockade against the people of Cuba, especially, as Osmaida said, for women. So recently I had the privilege of spending a month in Cuba. It was both a wonderful and a worrying trip for me. I had the opportunity to meet and speak to many women who told me their stories about how the blockade has affected their lives, their families' lives, their work. And many of them agreed to be videotaped, but I only have time to show one here. Uh, this morning for me, this afternoon for you. I'm in Seattle. So can we show this video? This is lesbian activist Olympia Diaz Borges from Cienfuegos, who, like the other women I met, lives with this blockade every day. And for most of them, they have lived with the blockade for all of their lives.
Mi nombre es Olympia Díaz Borges, soy cienfueguera cubana, tengo 56 años de edad. Mi trabajo es dedicarme a hacer activismo social de una forma voluntaria en ayuda y apoyo a todas estas campañas por la no violencia contra la mujer. Es importante que las personas tengan conocimiento de cuánto afecta el bloqueo a estas mujeres eh, que vivimos de activismo, porque económicamente eh, las ayudas, la alimentación, el problema de la transportación depende de que haya combustible. En mí, como persona, mi mamá vive lejos de mí, vive a más de 20 kilómetros y yo quisiera verla todos los días y me es difícil porque el combustible no está disponible para la transportación de que yo pueda ver semanalmente a mi mamá. Pero cuando voy al médico porque tengo un dolor, porque tengo afecciones eh, por salud y necesito un medicamento, no están porque la materia prima para confeccionar estos medicamentos está en otros países y el bloqueo hace difícil que entren a nuestro país. Ejemplo también está en que mi hija, joven, decidió emigrar eh, porque no es problema político, sino problemas económicos. Ella necesita eh, abrir su futuro, abrir sus estudios, abrir su vida, tener un bienestar, pero además desea, quiere ayudarnos a nosotros, a su familia, y eso es importante para ella. Y el bloqueo está haciendo que esto suceda. Otras cosas para el activismo también es difícil porque la comunicación, el intercambio con las personas que nos colaboran en otros países se hace difícil por esta misma situación del bloqueo, que ellos ponen leyes que regulan los viajes, que le hace difícil que, que ellos puedan venir o nosotros podamos ir, intercambiar sobre estos intereses que tenemos. Y, y yo quisiera ver a mis amigas, yo quisiera compartir con mis amigas, y eso me es difícil porque no hay manera si hay bloqueo.
So that was Olympia, and the last thing she talked about was the lack of ability to communicate with her friends, with us. We have a great relationship with many of the social gay and lesbian networks in Cuba. Because of the blockade, they aren't allowed to use Zoom and other platforms, so she can't even watch this whole wonderful workshop on Cuba and ending the Cuban blockade. I mean, the US blockade against Cuba. And she also mentioned her daughter, who is now living in Florida, who went there for economic reasons to try and make a better life, to try and help support her family. And she emphasized that her daughter left for economic reasons, not for political reasons. And this was a common theme that I heard from many of the women. She also mentioned the lack of fuel, which was, again, another common theme among the women I talked to. There's a snowball effect with the lack of fuel for things getting to where they need to be, repairing farm equipment. There's so many problems with the lack of fuel. And I also noticed when I was there the long lines when there was fuel available, and also long lines for food staples. And not the least of the problems that the women talked about, and each one of them mentioned the lack of medicines and medical equipment. I just want to give a shout out to folks like the Global Health Partners and Cuba Solidarity Campaign for their efforts to raise money and send much needed medicines and medical equipment to Cuba. And many of us try and bring as much material aid as we can when we visit Cuba. And though I was impacted by all the stories that I listened to, there was one in particular that stood out for me. And this was another young woman from Cienfuegos. She is a health educator for the Department of the Prevention of Sexually Transmitted Infections and HIV. She reports that there is a shortage of condoms, birth control methods, and supplies needed for assisted reproductive services, such as IVF. So women, including LGBTQ communities especially, are often not receiving the reproductive and women's health care they need due to lack of resources brought on by this criminal blockade. So we know that Cuba has been on the forefront of supporting reproductive rights of women, including abortion on demand. We heard Osmaida tell us that 1965 is when abortion was decriminalized in Cuba. So it was really unfortunate for me to learn that the lack of resources causes adequate or inadequate reproductive health care for Cubans. Let's see here. So we also heard from Osmaida about the constitutional rights, and I'm sure we'll hear more about constitutional rights and the Families Code from Dr. Yamila Gonzalez Ferrar. But the Families Code is a very progressive and comprehensive and truly revolutionary law, most recently passed or the most recent iteration passed in 2022, that protects the rights of women, children, LGBTQ communities, and many others. While meanwhile, here at home in the United States, the government is chipping away at our reproductive rights, as evidenced by the Dobbs decision in 2022 to overturn Roe v. Wade and make abortion illegal again in our country. And now, since that decision was made, not surprisingly, many states are chipping away at hard-fought LGBTQ rights. In 2022, lawmakers in the United States introduced more than 240 bills targeting LGBTQ people, particularly transgender children, threatening their health and rights. For example, lawmakers in Florida and Alabama enacted controversial laws limiting discussions of sexual orientation and gender identity in schools. You've probably heard of the Florida's Don't Say Gay law. State officials in Texas equated gender-affirming healthcare with child abuse and have ordered state agencies to investigate families and trans children. Violence against transgender people in the United States, particularly transgender women of color, remains a serious concern. Violence is exacerbated by structural discrimination against transgender people, including barriers to accessing employment, housing, and healthcare. Whereas the Cuban government treats trans rights and sex reassignment surgeries as health issues. Since 2008, Cuba's Minister of Public Health signed Resolution 126, an act that assured complete coverage for Cubans seeking sexual reassignment surgeries, the first of any country in Latin America to do so. And now Cuba is celebrated as having one of the most open and inclusive LGBTQ public health and education programs in the Americas. Cuba has provided an example of how the right to health for all moves towards breaking down the barriers of stigma by improving health outcomes for those with transsexual health needs. During my visit to Cuba, I also had the opportunity to talk with some women from the Afro Diverse Project. This is an Afro-LGBTQ initiative whose purpose is to empower and make visible Afro-LGBTQ people by means of a collaborative and participatory anti-racist and Afro-feminist approach from three fundamental premises: art, health, and community. Among the many topics we discussed was how the recent changes in Families Code law, which added protection of LGBTQ rights, has affected their lives and their community. Some of the benefits they mentioned are translated here to English and include egalitarian marriage, which protects us in conserving the assets that a couple has built up over time and gives us the assurance of mutual economic support. Legal support to create a family without any limitation. We can adopt and or have a pregnancy by assisted reproduction or artificial insemination. And in general, we have some protection that leads to everybody respecting us, because now they know that there is a requirement that this respect must exist. So I'd also like to put in a brief plug for the U.S. Women in Cuba collaboration and the Lesbian and Allies Project. Maybe somebody could put in the chat for me, lesbians and allies @gmail.com. We're currently trying to recruit more women to join our cause, and if you reach out to us, we'll let you know how you can get involved. And the the U.S. Women in Cuba collaboration website is womenandcuba.org. So in closing, first of all, I want to thank all of the women who shared their stories with me. The friends that I met and talked to about the blockade and the Families Code showed gracious hospitality, amazing creativity, innovation, and resiliency. And they are truly forward-thinking, and committed to independence, social justice, and peace. And as Osmida said, they are moving forward in self-determination despite this blockade. Please join our movement to fight to end the U.S. blockade and the travel ban and take Cuba off the list of state-sponsored terrorists. Abajo bloqueo. Thank you.